Welcome. The BCheque Chats is back after a 3, 4, 5 month hiatus. I'm here with a group of very established and prominent NFTers, thinkers, collectors, wise men from across the pond. Luke, Michael, Schmrypto, if that's pronounced correctly. Welcome. Thank you for joining me today. How are you doing?
Doing great. You?
Great.
Very well. So I wanted to reach out because you guys are very, very clued up on Jack Butcher's Checks project. So we definitely want to talk about that. We definitely want to talk about some general market stuff. The only kind of baseline rule or way I want to frame it is that I know that we are very interested in certain technical elements and can get very lost in the detail. I want to try to keep it at a relatively high level to start and think about it in terms of why this collection has captured so much mindshare, what makes it so valuable, rather than diving deep into the tech right away. Because I think in the realm of ideas is where this collection has become so valuable, and I want to start with that. So Schmrypto, as the largest checks holder, at least last time I checked, but I don't know if that's the case now, could you start us off as to why you think this is such a cool project and what got you so interested in it?
Absolutely, and I'm always quick to point out, I think I'm the largest public holder. If you look, there's a lot of wallets holding 30 to 40 checks and nothing else and no other trade history, and it's fairly indicative that there are a lot of people holding these things across a non-wallets. So I'm always I had hoped that the burn might bring them out of the woodwork, but we still haven't seen yet who the large stealth holders are. But and I know at least one personally who's not larger than me, but has a fairly large position that nobody knows about. So I know that there's others for sure.
Interesting. So what was it that got you into it in the first instance?
So my introduction to it was a couple different people just sending me a link to the mint, and two friends of mine reached out independently and both told me I should take a look at it. And I looked, and one of my friends had minted the largest number of them at 236. So I minted 237 just to be a jerk, mostly. And it was then, after the mint closed that we started getting details about how everything would actually work and what we could expect, and the early details were just so impressive. And knowing Jack's background and abilities, it was just pretty clear that I needed to go after it as hard as I could. So I just started liquidating aggressively, taking WETH offers on all kinds of stuff, making OTC deals for my punk and Mutant and a few other things, and just went as hard as I could. I look back now and I go, I could have gone so much harder, but I went as hard as I could stomach at the time.
Yeah, in hindsight, because of the mint being so cheap relative to normal mint on Ethereum being at $8, even minting hundreds is just not the same as minting hundreds of a traditional collection, right?
Oh yeah, I mean, if you had sold a Bored Ape, if you had taken a WETH off the collection offer on a Bored Ape and used that to mint checks, you could have 2 black checks, assuming the rules still played out the same way, which I don't think they would have. But because at the time the black check was announced, it's 4,096 checks required. I think I had 250 or 60 at the time.
Yeah.
And I was largest holder then. And so, it was designed to be impossible. So I feel like if somebody had 10,000 checks, we would have seen a very different game too. So
yeah, definitely. I think that would have changed it in substance. You mentioned Jack's background, and Luke, we were just talking off air, what about Jack's background and how he has really inspired a whole generation of kind of internet creators prior to this. Do you want to speak a little bit about how involved you've been and why it's been such an interesting process for you seeing this come about?
Yeah, so Visualise Value has been around for several years, and I think it really kind of took off in 2020 through the pandemic. And Visualize Value is Jack's brand, and it's just it's kind of an exercise in restraint. So his visual style is these black backgrounds with white illustrations, and the illustrations are often some sort of concept or quote or an idea, and he uses the visuals and the kind of the tools in the digital design tools to illustrate these ideas really simply and succinctly and with as much clarity as possible. So that was kind of Jack's prior work, and he has kind of dabbled in NFTs for a couple years. I think he had sold a one-of-one on Foundation called NFTs Explained in 2021 that sold for like 74 ETH. So he'd done a bunch of the one-of-ones, but obviously totally different model when you're going from selling one-of-ones to doing an open edition. But I think a lot of the ideas that came through Visualize Value are also what helped make Check so successful as well, which is this idea of using as much restraint and as many constraints as possible in order to create a visual that other people can build on top of, that other people can resonate with, which is in stark contrast to a lot of profile pictures or AI art or even pixel art that are much harder to kind of remix. He used some of the ideas with Visualize Value and turn those on its head visually, where it was the opposite of what his normal visual style was, which was black background, white image. And this was gray and white image with lots of colors. But the idea behind it was similar to a lot of the Visualize Value stuff, but the visual was a lot different. And now obviously it's gone back to kind of the black background with the burn and everything. But I think that's kind of the Visualize Value genesis. And then you asked kind of about the community, and basically he's had this community that's kind of moved from different platforms, but basically just people that resonated with the ideas of Visualize Value. And the Visualize Value community has, it's a really special group of people because it's a bunch of people that are all working for things and resonate with some of the ideas from the Visualize Value collections, and a bunch of really, really talented people in their own right that have been building really cool things in public and sharing ideas. And we help each other build things. And a lot of it is all kind of, it uses the ideas of Visualize Value to kind of bring people together.
That's awesome. It's definitely one of the things I wrote about in my newsletter as well, like this, because some people don't know this stuff, right? So they're kind of on Twitter talking about continuously focusing on the price action and the price of the thing without knowing the history of the person and what he's built. So I think it's really important to speak to that stuff. Michael, was it the same reason for you to get involved, or what was the inspiration for you?
For me, it was Jack's past, his history with Visualized Value, everything I've seen since I've been, interested in kind of taking complex and making simple is something that I kind of live by. And I'm just a simple styled individual to begin with. And so I've always been enamored with his ability to display the information in a very succinct and stylistic way. And so honestly, when I've known about Jack Butcher for years, when I was very interested in just financial markets, he popped up on my radar. And so at the start of 2023, when I saw that he was offering this piece of art, really, which my first instinct was, wait, I could get this cool piece of art and put it on my wall because it matches exactly the type of style. I like colors, I like minimalism, and it had it all. And I thought, it's $8. It makes sense for a sense. I'm like, I immediately was intrigued by it. And knowing his history, I was like, this is like a steal. It felt like it was Black Friday because I couldn't believe you could get this type of art that I was going to put on my wall. I love canvas art as well for $8. And so, I grabbed a couple with no other thought process, then let me get a couple and maybe even give some away. But what developed after that kind of tells the story of where we are now with checks. But that wasn't initially my thought. It was completely about, I really liked the style of the art that Jack had displayed, and what has come from that has been wildly past anything I thought of or could have even expected at the time. But that's initially what brought me in.
Yeah, that makes sense. To what extent does that kind of we were just talking off air about your mustache design and the kind of the thought process that's gone into that. To what extent is that inspired by this kind of minimalist aesthetic?
Listen, I'm very happy that my mustache is getting some time on this chat now for the world to see.
That's why we did that time in the beginning.
So you see, like, the minimalism, it flows to the face as well, because I actually got rid of all beard, any facial hair, so you could actually focus on the mustache, and it's clean, kept. So no, but the minimalism is been a key to my life. Like, if you came to where I live, if you saw my car, like, I have a Tesla. There's nothing in it, right? It's very simple. There's not a lot of gadgetry. I'm just attracted to simplifying things, and essentially because I think a lot of chaos in the world is created by us with clutter, whether that's physically, mentally, in general. So even when I wear clothing, like, I have flowers on the shirt, which is like the most you'll really see from me. Mostly I'm a not branded type of person. Which is funny because I got a bear on my hat, but shout out to the JPEG party. I did it for the for Web3. So I just believe that Jack epitomizes a lot of what I strive to achieve as an individual, with taking and disseminating information in a very concise manner. And what I've always been enamored by Jack is his ability to do it, because the one thing I know I'm not great at is design, like on a computer, and art per se, right? Like, I think that my art is more in communications and more in, I have a financial background. I'm not going to draw something amazing. I can try, but Jack takes that information and visually showcases it in such an epic way, and has done that way before there was checks. And so that's always been an inspiration to me to watch. And maybe we'll talk about it later, but I definitely want to note one of the coolest things for me during this experience in this year is my ability to get better at understanding how I could design some of my thoughts, and how I can create some of the art that I, have these ideas on or in my head, but just haven't been able to kind of put them to paper the same way. And so I've been able to learn some of that process and improve, which to me is super cool. And also a hidden idea of, it's not just about the price of the checks, but what you're learning from being involved with the checks.
Yeah, definitely. That's a really good point. Schmrypto, could you, so we're talking about this idea, and I think that the idea underlying all this stuff is one of the reasons why it's captured so many people's attention. Moving to the actual development of the collection, we obviously minted at $8, as we mentioned already. There were approximately 16,000 or so. What's been the journey? Just so people, because I know what's going to happen, because I've been on NFT Twitter for long enough now. Like, now they're going to say, well, where are all of them? What's going on with the colors? Like, what's going on? And then someone will say, well, just read the thread that explains it. But people don't read. So what's the kind of, we went from $8 mint. What's been the key kind of development for you? How it's kind of progressed?
Well, it's funny you say that about people not reading. You're absolutely right. And it kind of has just made me realize that maybe I need to hire like an animator or something to make an explainer. Because, people don't like to read. And that thread is long. Like, it's a pretty, like, by NFT standards,
yes,
it's a textbook.
You're talking about the Jack pinned thread, right? Where
kind of well, I don't know if it's currently pinned, but transparency time,
the other thing with it that makes it even harder for the kind of average person coming in is that it's not written like in retrospect all kind of consecutively. So you kind of have to, you're kind of picking up developments as they go. So it's not a holistically written thing, which is just an additional challenge. On top of the traditional challenge of people not reading.
Well, and I think in the beginning it made a lot more sense as a node to direct people to for understanding. Now it's become more of a historical document, I think, because it is so in the weeds and so stream of consciousness at times.
Sure. So looking back now with that perspective, though, how would you kind of lay out the progress to date?
I mean, I hate to say it after saying that, but like, really, the thread is the best history of the project. But what we need is a more succinct explainer. But it was really cool to see. It was I think the most public development process I've ever seen in tech. It was in real time, fairly open, just cataloging of the entire process, and a dialogue as well. It wasn't just, hey, this is how it's going to happen, get ready. It was, we're testing A and B, which do you like? You know, like that was literally, at one point there was literal A/B testing going on in the thread. So the first instance of that being when they decided early on that the lowest ID number would get carried through. So if you mix 10 and your birthday is gone and 10 has been preserved. And people went, well, what about my birthday? And so they just immediately pivoted to, you'll choose which number and gets preserved in the pass through. And it wasn't, they had no marriage to their initial idea. They threw it out there. There was some pushback. They instantly pivoted, and that kind of agility was just demonstrated over and over and over and over again throughout the design process. And that was a big part of what kept me buying when I had the liquidity to do so, and holding through all kinds of volatility. Is just, you know, I've seen the way this team works, and I know Jack's not going anywhere.
Well, why do you think, just interject quickly, and this is for anyone, why do you think that building in public process and just kind of being really transparent and open to feedback, why is that something which we consider a positive thing, which I agree with you, but that can sometimes be detrimental to a project if you listen to too many voices, right? So in this case, why did you think that's like, okay, this is a good thing to get behind?
My sense just personally was that it wasn't really going to become too many cooks in the kitchen, because Jack has a lot of confidence in his vision. And so there wasn't really a risk of him letting the community take the reins, but he was happy to take guidance, which I think is kind of the best you can hope for in a founder.
I agree. Anyone, any other thoughts on that, like on the transparency process from anyone?
Well, I thought that the transparency thread and everything that went into it was kind of awesome, because it was performance art, and it wasn't really it just kind of developed.
Interesting.
That authentically, and as you said, it wasn't sort of happening as a normal thread where it was just, you just read everything and that's it. It was just happening over a period of time, not just in a day, but in weeks. And it was allowing for some questions or comments without making those the important, focus. And so I think Jack obviously had his vision. He visualized it, and he was willing to accept a little bit of iteration or ideas to enhance it. And so all it did was, like, he had this amazing meal, and he said, oh, I could add a little ingredient that maybe I wasn't thinking about because someone made a suggestion, but it wasn't changing it. It was just actually evolving it and making it a little bit better. And I think that also actually created more of the community and people that were intrigued by the project, because it developed over a time frame of not just a day, but a week and then a month.
Yeah, and just to add on to that, I think a big part of what this project has become is a multi-dimensional project in so many ways, which is why I think it has so much staying power. Not only the art and the visual art and the social commentary and the on-chain art, but as Michael said, the performance component of it, where Jack is putting everything out there transparently. Not only that, but he's also boosting the signal of everybody who's creating derivatives. So much of, one of the dimensions is the community as well. And something we were talking about before we started the recording, but building the community from bottom up. where instead of going, here's a token, okay, now we need to build community and let's get people on, interested in the token by giving all these promises. It was the opposite. It was start with a community, people who follow me because they enjoy my ideas. And some of these ideas are like, have become courses that he's teaching. Like he's literally written the playbook for what he's doing already. And then the community, is drawn to a token, and then you can continue that project, and which is, in and of itself, kind of its own interesting aspect of the project is like how the community has become its own form of art. Not only with like the way that people have made derivatives and Jack has boosted that signal, but also how the community itself and the interactions that they have with Ethereum also play a part in the art that is created as well.
Yeah, it's a really strong point. I think I wanted to ask you to go into a little bit more detail on, so because Jack does these courses, right? And you said you've taken them before, and they've literally been game changing, or life changing, I think you said earlier. And again, when people are approaching a project in isolation, they see a price and they're like not clear on how it's got to that. He's obviously provided so much value in different forms in the past. Can you speak to a little bit how, what effect that taking that course had for you?
Absolutely. So there are three kind of primary ones that are the most, how can I put it? Like the ones that have, I think, probably drawn the most people to his work. And those are How to Visualize Value, Build Once, Sell Twice, and Permissionless Apprentice. And he has a compound content also, but that's a more recent one. But I think what really helped form the community was, Jack going, okay, I have this skill, which is I can, and he'd done it on the agency side as well, like, from an ad agency. So that's where he kind of learned how to do this. But he said, I have this skill, which is, I can visualize concepts in a really clear way. And so then he went, okay, well, let me build a course so I can teach people how to visualize concepts in a really, in their own way, I guess. But let me figure out the ways in which I can teach people how to do what I do. And so that was How to Visualize Value. And then his next course was, this is very meta, but his next course was Build Once, Sell Twice, which was take a skill that you have, productize yourself so you don't have to exchange your time for money. You can, so what he did with How to Visualize Value was he took a skill that he had, created a product, a course in this case, and taught people how to do what he does. So he no longer had to go to an ad agency or take money from companies to build stuff for them. He productized himself. And so then he did a course called Build Once, Sell Twice, which is teaching people how he did that, which is, he's using the stuff to build the next layer. And then Permissionless Apprentice, I don't know exactly what the timeline was, but Permissionless Apprentice is another one of those kind of core ideas to Visualize Value that I think a lot of people have been drawn to, because obviously, the ability to learn, design, and visualize your thoughts and ideas is a really valuable skill. Learning how to productize yourself so that you don't have to continue to exchange your time for money is a valuable skill. But then Permissionless Apprentice is kind of this, it's more of a principle or a set of values, which is, especially in Web3, don't wait for people's permission to do something. And it's really fun to have seen checks where people will go to him and just be like, hey, I have this idea for a checks derivative. Can I do it? And he's like, yes, that's the point. Like, go out and make this thing. You don't need my permission. If you want to build a checks website or build an L2 like Schmrypto had the idea to do, if you want to do your own art, but your own ways of visualizing checks or writing about it, you don't need anybody's permission. If something inspires you and something drives you to want to make something, don't ask for, how can I get involved with this? Just make the thing, and if people like it and people find value in it, they will tell you. And so those are some of kind of the core concepts from his courses that I think he is actually put into practice with checks. And I think that's one of the really cool things about checks is a lot of people who just saw the price going, exponential, get in, and then they start going, what is all this about? And then they read the transparency time and they go, wow, this guy's a really effective communicator. What else has he done?
Yeah.
And then he's kind of written the playbook that he's implementing now, up until now. So he's done it all real time, which is really cool.
Yeah, in hindsight, it makes perfect sense, doesn't it? Like the intersection of what he's done creating on the internet with crypto, like it just makes perfect sense that he takes the next steps into like being able to build out on the crypto layer in that respect, because the permissionlessness, the kind of self-sovereignty element where it's like, look, you want to, the game, the end point or the aim is to want to try to build something for yourself so that you are not dependent on others. Like there's a clear philosophical connection between those two things. Schmrypto, what's the plan? What's the plan? Like, so we've discussed a lot of the ideas, and I really wanted to do that because I think when I looked into Jack, and I've been aware of him for a while, I wanted to touch on those ideas. So checks obviously started at the price they did, $8. It's gone up. There's this burn mechanic, which reduces the supply, and there are various iterations of checks that get produced as a consequence. As the largest known holder, as you said, what's the plan for you? If you are willing to disclose.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, no, I always, transparency to the point of idiocy is my general approach. Currently, I turned number one into a one check yesterday so that I could get the 1 day metadata on it. Made it entirely out of checks that started with ones as well, just to make the oneiest check I could manage. Cool. I realized in hindsight that there's also a speed trait that gives you has a 1x, and maybe I should have done that as well, but I wanted it to be fast, so it is what it is.
So how many checks were required to create the one check?
64. And, if you just kind of bash them all together, you'd probably spend an hour or two on it. Probably an hour if you just went totally random, just grabbed out randoms and burned them up. But I wanted a red 2x speed, and I wanted to make it entirely out of checks that started with 1. And so it took me about 12 hours to groom through everything and find ones that checked all the boxes and pair test just endlessly. But I got what I wanted. There's a lot of reds too, and I wanted a bright red. And that's kind of the trick, is like narrowing it down to 1 or 2 colors is really tricky. The breeding mechanics are actually pretty subtle.
Just to explain a little bit, I know you said we're not going to go too technical, but I'm interested in, like, so there's an element of, like, kind of, well, you become the creator now. So obviously Jack created the collection. Now you take on the reins as a kind of co-creator. How much scope do you have to determine the path of your one check? Like, if you said you want a bright red, where did you start and how did you get to that?
Well, so a one check can really only have a few meaningful traits. It has a color, it has a speed that it changes, because they are animated. These are a little bit like squiggles, where most people don't realize they're animated until they click on one and then it shocks them. Yeah. I've heard squiggles collectors within the last couple months be like, oh my god, squiggles are animated? I'm like, yeah, guys, it's always been animated. Checks are kind of the same way. A lot of people, I tell them they're animated and they go, huh? And so they have an animation speed, they have an animation direction. So do you go from red to blue or from blue to red? And then they have a date of creation. And so the day that you performed the last burn in that piece's sequence will show up in its metadata. And so that's why I hustled, and glad I started when I did. I thought it would take me a couple hours. So I got started, and thank God I started like 13 hours before the deadline, or I would not have made it. And so, and in addition to that, you have 80 colors. Colors are discrete. If you mix 2 colors, it's not going to sit there and find the average of those colors. It's going to pick from the existing colors. So there's only 80 possible colors a check can be. And And they range pretty good. There's some dull ones and some bright ones and some good variety. There's no monochrome. So if you're looking at the marketplace and you see a wall of just black or grayish checks, that's an unrevealed check, not a miracle of the odds just hitting all black. But you can get one color. And then there's color banding as well. It doesn't apply to one checks because you only have one check left. But in multi-check pieces, you can have, so for instance, if I say something is an 80 band, then all 80 colors appear or can appear in it. 40 band, 20 band, 10, 5. And so a one band is just one color, a solid piece of one color. They tend to trade at the highest premium of any of the just 80 check basic pieces. And then, you talked about it being a collaborative effort yesterday to kind of I wanted to do something that would make sense with the day two metadata. So I took two, one color, one band, 80 checks and burned them together to make the only existing check with just two colors. Checks either have one color or 5 or more colors. There's only one check with 2 colors, and it's that one I burned last night.
Interesting. How are you thinking? Because I know that, obviously we're all in the digital asset collecting space. I know from our previous conversations, I would say you're a relatively sophisticated collector in the physical space too. In a way, what's determining these kind of decisions that you're taking in terms of numbers or whatever, because there's no precedent here, right? There's no precedent as to say, oh, if I take these 2 colors, I know, Luke, you were going for some basketball numbers and colors, so we'll speak about that in a second as well. What's the driving force for your decisions at the moment?
I think being a part of the history of the collection right now is what really fascinates me. A line I've used a couple times recently is I think the time value of clout is higher than the time value of money, and I plan to do this forever. And so these sort of performative actions are more valuable to me right now than ETH is, and
that's really important.
Oh yeah, I think people underestimate that and how powerful a marketing spend not selling is sometimes, or how powerful a marketing spend taking a financially suboptimal path is, the signals you can send by doing that. Because burning those 2 one checks I burned together last night, I could have gotten a lot more for them independently than I'll probably ever get in the short term for the piece that resulted. But the piece that resulted is now kind of a cool part of the story of checks. So if checks end up in museums, then this is kind of an especially desirable piece in that context. It doesn't really matter.
And you literally wrote that history.
Exactly, yeah. And so I'm part, and so when you look at, if that piece ends up in a museum, the artist's credit, to my mind, is, Jack Butcher, Jaleel, Traff, and me, which I hope that becomes kind of the standard for museums when they handle checks pieces. Like, the last person to burn that piece needs to be a part of the, not just the provenance of the piece, but the credit of the piece, I believe. And I think
that's really cool.
Yeah. And if checks become a ticket to getting your name on the wall in the Pompidou or the Louvre, or that kind of changes the game. Like, if that becomes the curatorial standard that we treat these things as co-creations, that becomes a pretty powerful signaling thing as well.
Do you think that's something that's foreseeable?
I do. I think we already see museums talking about taking squiggles. We see museums interested in fidenzas. There's a lot of interest in these other Art Blocks collections, and at the end of the day, Art Blocks doesn't own the generative art space. Generative art has been around since the early 20th century, but as we kind of would recognize it, since the 60s or 70s. And so there's a huge body of work that's just now kind of starting to come to market. Even in the in the vintage space, 5 years ago, if you tried to sell a vintage plotter, you might get a few $100 for it. Sotheby's did a auction of Vera Molnar pieces recently, and they were going for between $30,000 and $120,000. And so the whole generative art space is heating up really pretty aggressively. And what we haven't seen in generative art prior to this is a collaborative project. Generative art is, Fidenza by Tyler Hobbs, Swiggle by Snowfro. This is the first generative piece that I'm aware of that is a collective effort. And that, I think, makes it significant in the history of generative art.
I think that's definitely true. The only other, I mean, to your 2 points, definitely the generative art, the kind of the physical generative art market is heating up in London. I was in conversation trying to get hold of some. Is it Herbert Frank? Physical
Franca, but yeah,
Franca pieces, and just for like a print, I think they were selling for thousands, or they were trying to sell for thousands of pounds. So it's definitely heating up. And then the second point I was going to make, I've forgotten, which is not ideal. But Luke, in the meantime, you had a specific kind of driving force. Why don't you explain that while I try to remember the other thing?
Well, actually, real quick, because Rippe and I actually haven't talked about this, so I wanted to ask Rippe, what have you done with your checks? Like, have you migrated all of them? Have you composited any? Like, what was in your bag?
So I've just migrated one on day one, just one, because I had to have a day one that I did, and then I did a day two migration, and that's it. I've been slow because I want to just live vicariously through some of the others that are doing it quickly, like our friend the King, Schmrypto, and others. But I've been more reserved, clearly, and just exuding a lot of patience. Although the more that I see the art and the colors and the gradients and everything, it makes me I'm itching to do more. But I like the idea of having just the original, untouched, not migrated or burned anything to make a decision on what I do in the future. So right now, I'm just slow playing.
What did you end up pulling with your two?
Nothing, no linears or nothing wild, just good looking art.
Nice. Okay, so
Yeah.
So I guess maybe this is the best way to kind of explain what I kind of want to do with my number 23 is maybe just for anybody who isn't familiar with the mechanics, I'll just kind of give a brief overview of the mechanics. So
yeah, that's great.
What everybody minted are editions, and there are 16,031 editions minted, and then those editions all have the same image, and that image is just a SVG that's hosted on IPFS, and so that image can change, and Jack has kind of used that as part of the performance art to change the image metadata so that people have to kind of question, what did I buy? What is an NFT? What is this thing that I paid $8 for or $1,000 for or $4,000 for? And when that image is changing all the time, that is part of the commentary as well. So those are all the additions. But when Jack realized that this was obviously when 16,031 editions mint, there's some indication there that people are interested in what you're doing. So that's when he started the transparency time thread and implemented all these mechanics. So basically, if you have an edition, that's just, again, an image that is hosted on IPFS. What they introduced is a contract and a user interface that connects with the contract so that if you migrate your editions through the contract, it puts them on chain. And your choice to do that generates some level of randomness, which is based on a random number generator, essentially, of the time that you chose to do that. So that's how you interact with the blockchain, which helps create the art. Then what you get is an original piece that has some, and Schmrypto has talked about some of the traits, but some different, completely original checks colors, which can be completely random. They can span the whole color spectrum. They can have a gradient, vertical gradient, horizontal gradient, an angular gradient. They can have a very tight band, which only shows like reds and pinks, or light blues and dark blues, or light greens and dark greens. So there's a few different ways of doing that. So what I want to do with 23 is, sorry, and then I want to talk about the burn mechanics too. So those are 80 check originals, meaning they have 80 an 8x10 grid of checks, like check marks. Then you can take 2 of those and use the interface again, use the user interface, burn 2 down to get a 40 check. So your check now has 40 checks on it, and then burn 2 40s to get a 20, burn 2 20s to get a 10, burn 2 10s to get a 5, burn 2 5s to get a 4, and burn 2 4s to get a 1. So if you do all the math there, you basically end up with 64 additions, which all get burned down to 64 80 check originals, which get burned down to 32 40s, 16, I know the nomenclature here gets really tricky, but 32 40s, 16 20s, 8 10s, 4 5s, 2 4s, and that's like the final, and then you end up with the 1. So when Schmrypto was talking earlier about getting a 1 check, basically he had to burn 64 80 checks all the way down to get to his 1 check. So that's the basics of the mechanics. So what I would like to do, because I'm never going to own 64, I'm not Schmrypto. I have, I think I've got like 13 or 14. I forget exactly how many I've got. But I'm never going to get to 64. I've been priced out. So what are my options? So one of the options is a basically collective ownership over a check. So I minted number 23, which has a lot of mimetic value. And because all of the images were the same early on, especially, numbers were kind of discovered as this way of like ascribing meaning to the tokens that all have identical pictures, essentially. Now, of course, they're originals, so the impact of the number means a little bit less, but still, number 23 is mimetically very valuable to people because of Michael Jordan and the Jordan brand and the GOAT and LeBron James when he was at Cleveland, and the year 2023 when checks minted. So there's a lot of meaning behind 23. And I just got lucky. I minted 23 as soon as I saw Jack's tweet about mint this. So I didn't deserve this necessarily. I just happened across it. And, I was a big Michael Jordan fan when I was a kid. So because I'm never going to be able to turn it into a 1 check on my own, what I would like to do is use this as a further way of incorporating collaborative tools so that we can get to collective ownership of the 23, and ideally make it red, just like Schmrypto's red 1 check. So that would be the goal, is to get down to kind of like a red 1 check 23 that's owned by the people, where people sent 64 checks in so that we can make it, and everybody can kind of own a piece of that. And maybe, I haven't really figured out the mechanics of this, and Schmrypto can probably talk a little bit more about the black check DAO later, which we haven't touched on. But for me, I think one thing that's really cool is these $8 pieces of art that are now thousands of dollars. It's kind of a hard entry point for people that are just finding out about the project. But because of the way the mechanics are created, it provides incentives for collaboration and for different models of getting people in at lower price points. So you can imagine if I issue the 64, collaborative checks, and people get like a receipt that shows, I contributed to this 64 check, the 64 checks that made the red 1 check 23, then those people could further fractionalize it so that a bunch of people, you could make like a $1 mint price for an open edition, and then that just points to the image of the 1 check so that you can spread the ownership of the symbolic ownership of this meme that means a lot to a lot of people across more people.
Yes, that's a really cool point. And you're right that the number 23 and certain numbers in general, right, have such intrinsic value to different groups of people. Schmrypto, could you speak a little bit to, so the thing I was going to say kind of linked to what we're just saying there, where like you guys are all becoming part of the creative process. The only other time I've seen that so far in the generative art process is with the QQL mint with Tyler Hobbs, where obviously people bought the QQL mint pass and then were able to generate the seed and decide what output was created. Now, the interesting thing there is that, and I guess we're figuring this out as we go along, right? Like how values are ascribed to these things. It seems to be the case that A, the mint pass is traded higher than the pieces themselves, and B, that there might be some premium attached to the co-creator. And I think one of the things the market was kind of suggesting was that, you know, say I had a QQL and I create it. Well, if I'm not, you know, a significant artist in some respect, then maybe that might not be as valuable as like a really cool artist who has co-created with Tyler Hobbs. And so then maybe the market would value that one more. I don't know if there's specific examples of, because I think Xcopy has some QQLs and some other prominent artists had some QQLs. I don't think they've kind of decided on their output yet, but I'd love to see what happens there versus the kind of other really great outputs that are made, but just maybe by less prominent people. Do you have a view on that in terms of the creative collaboration?
I kind of wonder if we'll see the same premium for artists' names on checks because checks is such a restrictive palette. You know, QQL, Xcopy can probably make a QQL that looks like an Xcopy. But it might be hard to make a checks that looks like an Xcopy. I guess if you got a hold of a purple one band and a neon green one band and mashed them together, that's funny. I'll have to see if we can get a hold of a neon green and a purple one band and convince Xcopy to be the one to do the burn. Then you've probably got that's the most Xcopy checks you're ever going to get. But yeah, I could see in QQL it being a little more important to price who the artist was, just because the palette is a little more flexible. Actually, I'm friends with a fairly well-known experimental filmmaker who's interested in generative art and AI and stuff. And so I've thought about buying a QQL just to have him do it, and then I'll put it in my museum, you know.
That would be cool.
Yeah.
But it's interesting that your mind goes to that then, right? Because if you've been thinking about that, my line of thinking isn't a million miles off, where it's like, well, I could do the seed, I could generate a cool seed myself and do it, but if that person does it, you know, even yourself, you're thinking, well, I'd stick that in my museum and it would feel slightly different.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I think a lot of people who are popping QQLs for themselves are doing it wrong. I view QQL as a tokenized single collection commission system. So people should be buying QQLs and finding artists that no one has imagined doing a QQL. So, like, for instance, the filmmaker, Godfrey Reggio is the filmmaker. He did Koyaanisqatsi, and it's a fairly famous experimental film. No one would expect him to do a QQL. And so it's kind of a fun person to have do one. And I think that's really the cooler game with that particular token, is finding artists who people will value and be surprised by.
Yeah, definitely. And so just to clarify, in what way do you think this is different to that? Is it because of the art itself that makes it just a separate thing?
No, I might be being a little too close-minded. People might genuinely care if a check comes from Xcopy. I just think that QQL, you can the artist's voice can kind of come through a little more with QQL than it's going to be able to in checks. Well, and by which I mean the flavor of a specific artist. Like, I suspect when Xcopy pops his QQLs, what results is going to look pretty Xcopy-ish. Whereas he would have to go out of his way to buy a specific set of checks to create a specific palette to invoke his own work. Like, it's just a very different creative process. I think it's a creative process that's more likely to make artists of collectors than to favor existing artists. If that makes any sense. Yeah,
it does. I want to ask you a little bit about the black checks in a second, or the black check DAO. But Michael, to what extent have you been gripped by this kind of desire to become, like, have you found this an interesting way to become part of that creative process? Or are you more sitting on the sidelines now and just observing?
Well, I'm sitting on the sidelines in the sense that I don't have the ammunition or potential to get a black check unless I'm part of the collaborative process that, you know, Schmrypto creates for someone else, and I can get involved in that way. So that's the way I look at it. I mean, I think it's fascinating to watch, and I'm excited to see it play out, whether it's a short-term thing or a long-term move to get maybe not just one black check, but a second black check. But I would certainly want to
Yeah, sorry. Just because one of the things I think that's interesting and hasn't necessarily been decided in the space is this kind of co-owning of assets. Like, people talk about DAOs in a fairly idealistic way sometimes, and it's like, okay, yeah, we can all just co-own stuff, but over a period of time, sometimes co-ownership can have its own issues. As you think about it, as someone without the ammunition, are you kind of happy to go through that DAO process and provide your assets? Should, if you like the idea of what the DAO is going for, would you be happy to go that route?
Yeah, so there's a few levels to that question. One, 100%, I want to contribute X amount of checks to the idea of potentially being able to get to the needed checks to claim the black check. And so for me, that's an easy decision, as I've got a number of checks, and they were all got purchased or minted at such a low entry that maybe it's not the same mindset for others. With that being said, there is a lot around the idea of DAOs, the struggles that they've come into in the past, and making sure that there's a security aspect and an understanding of what you're contributing to. But I know Schmrypto has been disclosing and talking and working on this, and I have a lot of trust and belief that what he puts out there will be audited and will be checked out to make sure that if you put a check in, you can take that check out. That's what I've heard consistently. And so, for me, it's an easy decision. I definitely have kept some checks to make sure they're specifically going to be put towards the larger goal of getting a little bit of that black check or being one of the people involved. And so I can't speak more deeper on it, because I think Schmrypto knows a lot more than I do, since he's working on that specifically. But I'm absolutely of the mindset that I want to participate. I've been watching from afar, reading, educating, and paying attention, because I want to at least be a participant.
That's super interesting. It's one of the things I'm really keen. Like, so I'm not in the check system, right? But one of the things I'm always on the lookout for is just watching people's behavior, like observing and trying to determine, like, people are talking about this, but are they really going to do it? Because some of my observations on DAOs up to this point is that, it's a nice idea, but it's kind of hard in practice. So I find it really interesting to observe and listen to what people's views are on this in particular. Schmrypto, as Michael said, you're planning the black check DAO, or have been planning the black check DAO. Could you explain a little bit just what it is and what your plans are for it?
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things that really kind of caught my attention in the early days of the project was when they announced that we'd be able to burn 4,096 checks to form a black check. So 64 one checks, which themselves require 64 checks, is the math there.
And am I right in thinking that would essentially be a quarter of the collection?
Yes, and you can do that 3 times. And so what you end up with is a remainder of about 58 one checks. So the kind of end game ecosystem is 3 black checks and a very small originals collection versus what we're kind of used to seeing. I think a lot of people early on thought that even 1 black check was impossible. I think we've changed some minds there, that people are a little more open to the idea that this could actually happen, and maybe that it could happen quickly. I think the dynamics between Blackcheck DAO 1 and Blackcheck DAO 2 are kind of intriguing, because Blackcheck DAO 1, you're participating because you want to be part of this new thing that's never happened before, and you want to be right on the vanguard. Blackcheck DAO 2, you've kind of seen that it works, and you can see what Blackcheck DAO 1 did or did not succeed at, and how that played out for everyone. So, I think whether or not we get 1, I think 1 is very doable. Whether or not we get 2 will kind of depend on the success or failure of the resulting DAO. If the resulting DAO is some huge value add for members, then check number 2 will happen pretty quickly too, I think.
What do you think, like, in your early visions of it, what would a successful Blackcheck DAO look like?
I mean, I think a lot of the parameters are going to be set by the DAO. Like, I've tried to be careful so far not to try to pigeonhole the DAO too much, because it's going to be up to its members, and we don't know what that membership is going to look like, really. But I think something where, and I don't want to say this because I don't want to make it sound like this is something that I am taking responsibility for, because, again, I would take responsibility for the aggregator. The DAO is up to the DAO members. But I think a successful DAO looks like a DAO token that trades at a premium to a check. Like that is one indication. You know, there are other ways to define success, but I think one indication of a successful DAO will be that if you put one check in and then we burn for the black check, and now that DAO token you got trades for more than the check that you traded in would, that's a pretty objective measure of success. That tells me that people find participation in the DAO to be more valuable than the benefits of just holding a check. And we're going to map the check contributed to the DAO token held pretty perfectly. And so the hope is that anybody coming in and wanting to incentivize the checks ecosystem by giving an allow list to checks holders or an airdrop to checks holders will also include DAO holders in that. Like, there's really no reason not to. They're checks holders. They hold a black check collectively, and you can look at their DAO tokens to see what checks were turned in or what check was used to create that DAO token. So hopefully you'll get, the idea being basically that you'll get all the benefits of being a checks holder as a DAO holder and the benefits of being a DAO holder. One thing I think a lot of people have in mind that I want to kind of disavow people of is the idea that the DAO will achieve the black check and then sell it to some crazy billionaire, a multiple of what it costs to get there, you know, and then distribute those funds. Like, we're gonna all put in a check apiece. We're gonna sell the black check for 4 times the floor, and everybody can then go buy 4 checks. Like, no, that's not legal. One thing the DAO cannot do, at least currently, maybe someday, you know, you never know what the rules look like in 10 years, but currently the DAO cannot distribute funds to holders proportional to their holdings. That makes it a security pretty much instantly, no matter what else you did. And so, and, you know, and I'm not ruling out the idea that the DAO could be securitized someday. If the DAO ends up being a big enough deal, there are processes it could go through to be turned into a security. Like, that's not out of the question, but that's a down the road thing. And in the meantime, and if that was done, then the DAO could distribute funds in that way. But in the meantime, what the DAO represents is either control of the black check and its fate, and if it is disposed of, then control of those funds and their fate. And those funds can be used to create an incubator for Web3. They could be used to create an investment fund that just collects and holds and trades and flips. Like, there's a lot of things the DAO could do with the money if they were to sell the black check. But I don't think you have to sell the black check to monetize it. I think the holding of it is such a clear demonstration of intent and kind of a power move by the DAO that you'll see a lot of deal flow and a lot of benefits to the DAO that will derive just from holding the check. Now, that's highly speculative, but we'll see.
Yeah, I think it comes... Could you just say, what was the quote you said earlier again? I think it comes to exactly that, though. What was it?
Which part?
The thing where it's not about... In essence, it's not about the ETH right now. It's about the...
Oh, the time value of clout. Yeah.
That's the one. The time
Exactly,
value of
yeah.
clout is worth more than the time value of ETH.
Yeah, exactly. And that the black check DAO will just be this fount of clout if it's done correctly, you know, that will trickle down. Being a big holder of a cloudy DAO is itself cloudy. There's a whole clout economy, I think, that people kind of ignore.
There really is. And often, sometimes when I evaluate collections, you think of the person behind it and to what extent they exist online. And therefore, the more that they exist online, the more likely they are that their clout is attached to their online existence. And now with these tokenized things which trade all the time, their very existence is chartable. And so there are certain people who have to be incredibly invested in making sure that things perform well. And I think it's really interesting that you mentioned that, you know, one of the ways to objectively determine the success of the DAO is by saying, well, this token is going to have to trade at a certain number. And I think lots of people would shy away from that accountability because they don't want the responsibility of taking ownership of it and like trying to build something up that's demonstrably meaningful and valuable to people. But I think it really does come down to that.
Yeah, and I think that should people put their check in and then the DAO token ends up trading at half the value of a check, people are going to view that as a failure.
Yeah.
Now, personally, the way I kind of view this is, again, like the aggregator that we're building, and Luke is involved in that effort as well, and the aggregator that's being built, that I do take some responsibility for. The group takes responsibility for that to a degree, but that's not a durable promise. That's meant to collect 4,096 checks and then go away. That's not meant to run forever. It's not meant to be a project per se in the traditional sense. It's meant to have a very finite goal and conclusion. Once that happens, I'm a 12.5% max, maybe a little less, 12.5% member of the DAO, and that's it. I'm just another member of the organization that results. And I'll have a lot of influence there, and I'd like to participate in a very real way, but the DAO will determine what its course is, and the DAO's course will ultimately determine the value of that token.
Let me just add a little bit.
While we're in the aggregator phase, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh, sorry, I was just going to elaborate more on the difference between the aggregator and the DAO, but continue what you were saying.
Oh, I was just going to say that while we're in the aggregator phase, I'm pretty strongly incentivized to try to push value to the DAO token just because that's how we make it. People aren't going to we make it because there's going to be a one-to-one value because they're totally arbable. And so as long as the value you derive from holding a DAO token is greater than the value you derive from holding a check, checks should flow into the DAO.
Got it. Yeah. That makes sense. And Luke, did you want to go, and then I'll ask a follow-up question?
Sure. So just to kind of get a little bit more, I know we want to stay at kind of a high-level overview, but just to touch on the technical differences here between maybe like a DAO and what we're creating. So when Schmrypto talks about the aggregator, what we're talking about is just creating a smart contract. And I think of it kind of like an ATM or a vending machine where you put a check in and you get a receipt, and that receipt says you put X number of checks in, and it scales based on the tier of check that goes in. So Schmrypto is going to take his one check number one and put it into the aggregator, put it into the ATM, and because it's a one check, 64 checks went into that one check. So he's going to receive a voting token, a DAO token, that holds a weight of 64 votes. And he'll have token ID number one on the DAO token that he gets back. And then because it's on Ethereum, there's a persistent record of that transaction. And so everybody that adds their checks to the DAO, which in this case, it's not really a DAO, it's just interacting with a contract that gives you an ERC 721 back. So it gives you an NFT back to prove that you contributed, and then you get the token number that is sequential. So as people add to the DAO, the token ID goes up, and the highest the token ID could go is 4096 because there's only 4096. But because, of course, people are going to put in checks that aren't just 80 checks, like Schmrypto is already putting in a 64 vote token, so that's going to reduce the total number, right? So the total number of tokens shrinks down until you hit that number, and then once you hit that black check number, now that you mentioned earlier the swap, this is a very important distinction. If you put a check in and you get your receipt, up until 4096 are contributed, you can always swap those in and out, which is when he was talking about the, arbing. He's talking about the ability, because this DAO token is mapped to this check, you can always get your check back by putting the DAO token back in. So that's a very important function, because we don't want people to send their checks, just as a PSA, don't send your checks to any sort of DAO contract that you can't get it back. You always want to be able to pull your checks back out by swapping your DAO token back in. And then once 4,096 are contributed, then that swap function locks, and anybody that has a check in there now has a DAO token that says, yes, I contributed, and then the burn happens, and then what you're left with is DAO tokens that represent a collective ownership of potentially the most valuable piece of art that's ever been created.
The cloutiest token.
That's the hope.
Sounds good. I'm conscious we've done an hour now. I just want to wrap up with a couple of final questions. I guess, Schmrypto, I'd ask you first, what do you think, like, what's the kind of practical next steps that will be kind of in the process being taken to get to the BCheque? And then finally, from everyone, just kind of, how's it been? What's the kind of prediction now as you've seen the price action go up? It's obviously come back down a little. Where are we sitting?
As far as what's next for the BCheque DAO, we've got the architecture entirely keyed in at this point. What we're really struggling with right now, or struggling's not really the word, but what we're focused on right now is protecting the DAO against a 51% attack. And so, early on I thought, the threat is that somebody has secretly accumulated 4,096 of these things and they're just going to get the BCheque, and that sucks. But I think the bigger threat is that somebody has accumulated 2,049 of these things. They'll chuck the entire pile into a BCheque DAO and then just send the BCheque to themselves because they control the wallet. And so we're working right now to put some systems in place to help protect against that. I'm doing some outreach to other DAOs, because I think getting other DAOs to take positions in this thing provides a lot of protection against 51% attacks, because they're almost definitionally not nefarious actors. And so, that's kind of the focus right now, is on the final security considerations more than anything else. The code, we've got 2 coders working right now, using AI to try to really increase their throughput, which is fun. It's crazy that we're already there. We've got basically 2 human coders and an AI coder working in tandem, and that's crazy real thing. It's here. Sci-fi. The future is now. And so because of that, we're going to be able to create a fairly sophisticated piece of code in fairly short order, I think. So what I think people should expect is a trustless, permissionless aggregator that's been audited to death, that will likely result in a DAO that may use supermajorities for existential decisions to protect against a 51% attack as well. But we'll see. One thing we're kind of toying with is gating the first part of the mint. And so if you have, for instance, like a 70% supermajority is required to dispose of the BCheque, then you really just need to make sure that at least 40% is distributed widely, and then it's very hard for anyone to 51% attack. Like, it's still possible theoretically. Where those lines are is a little arbitrary. So we're playing with that a little bit and consulting with some folks with some background in DAOs about how they prevented this, and because it's a serious consideration. Like, that's the nightmare scenario, is a 50% attack. So
okay, so really good steps being taken to kind of deal with that. Michael, what's your view on the journey so far? Price up, price down. Where are we heading?
Man, if I knew where we were heading, wouldn't that be amazing? I can't predict the future. Never have been able to, but I can only make my most educated of guesses. I think that over time, the entire Cheques project, which at this point is now sort of out of Jack's hands at a lot of levels, but still remains at some levels, his creation and iteration. He can still work on some of the metadata changes to some of the stuff that I even haven't, migrated. At this point, it's more in the hands of the world, and for collectors of art, whether that's physical, digital, to find it, for museums to come and learn about it, to display the idea of a check, and maybe not just a single black check, but maybe a check that we've seen in different colors, or even, your standard 80 check. I think we'll see all sorts of developments on what art collectors, historians, people that love art will come to find the collection. We're 6 weeks into this entire idea that is going to play out over not just the rest of the next few months of this year, but years. And so it can be hard in the moment to kind of take that long-term view. But for me, I don't really think about the price. When I think about the art and what is to come, I'm just excited for the kind of the gamification part of it to continue to play out, where you see the different art styles of checks being created, burned, and to see some of the things that come that people are not talking about. Just one thing I've thought about recently, since you can now burn, mash checks together and create some of your own kind of art styles from the checks, is at some point I think there'll be some of the checks will start to display imagery inside of them through the colors, and whether that's an initial, whether that's a kind of just a graphic that kind of comes from the way that the colors blend. I don't think we've seen it just yet, but I really do expect some of that to be this like next level art inside of the art. So I'm kind of trying to peruse them early to see that, but that's the only prediction I'd like to make here. But if anybody knows how to predict the future, please get in touch with me as soon as possible, and we can work together. I will be a great team player.
Luke, what do you think?
Oh, there's so much to cover. Actually, one thing that is really important to me personally has been the educational component of checks. And actually, before I kind of give my where are things going ramblings, I was wondering if maybe, Rippe, if you could touch, because I've heard you talk about on Spaces, and you talk about it really eloquently, about just what checks has done for the community, but also for you in terms of getting you from somebody who had limited design skills to somebody who is now creating a regular update on the ratios thing. So maybe if you could talk about that a little bit and how it's kind of inspired you to become more of a creator, a designer.
Yeah, sure. So, and I've said this in other recordings, other conversations that we've had around the project, and I think I said it even at the start of this conversation around checks, that the hidden, and maybe not so hidden depending on how you look at it, aspect of this entire performance art, this entire experience with checks has been that there's a huge learning component, not just where you can learn about art, and what is art and what is art to you, and learn about the gamification and game theory and all these other areas, but you can actually learn by participating in the ecosystem. And so for me, understanding and learning even more on a more detailed level about Jack and Visualise Value, and actually not just watching what he creates, but saying maybe I can start trying to create my own version of Visualise Value in the way that I want to showcase what I see from idea to actual component that I can produce. And so that's been a really neat aspect where I've been able to learn a little bit more than where I started. And so the program Figma, for example, was always foreign to me. Many may hear this and go, yeah, I don't know what that is, or I don't know how to use it. And so I've been able to learn how to, at a basic level, use Figma to take idea and put it to actual design element, and then iterate and improve on it. And a lot of that is not just due to Jack as the starting point and seeing what he does, but also to you, Luke, who has gone through probably more time than he wanted, my silly questions or help that I needed on things that probably are very routine, but seemed foreign for me at the start. But I've gotten a lot better at now taking ideas that I think about and saying, man, I can't do that, to saying, actually, I have this idea and I can do that, and here's how I can. And I've learned a lot of that because of Jack Butcher checks, and visualize value.
Yeah, beautifully put. Yeah, that's, I mean, for me to be able to see the whole community kind of just explode in creativity has been one of the coolest parts of checks to me. And like you said at the very beginning, I think the project is so great because everybody can take checks and remix it in their own way, and not just like by doing like a derivative with their own image in the 8x10 grid. More so, like you said earlier, if your art is communication, you know, if your art is doing technical analysis on the charts, if your art is writing threads about it, if your art is making derivatives, or if your art is writing code that is inspired by the checks contract, there's so many different layers to it. And I think that's really, I don't think people will really understand the ramifications of a project that kind of can do all of those things in one. And I think that there's something so amazing about this idea of like all this different multi-layered levels of art. I mean, art at every single possible layer, and what those inspirations are going to become, because we're so early still. Like, I mean, it's amazing that this project is like just over a month old, and we're going to see so many different things that are going to grow out of the seeds that have been planted by checks. So from the idea of a lot has been talked about, like the open edition meta, but that's one possible way to look at it. Planting the seed for open edition metas, or open edition with burn mechanics, the contract and the ideas of what is an NFT, and creating, once it becomes code, once it becomes an SVG generated by code that lives on Ethereum, now it's immutable, now it's forever, and that's its own thing too. So I think it will plant some seeds for people in thinking about how to create generative on-chain art. I think it's also going to plant these seeds about how to build a project from the bottom up with transparency and building in public, and taking feedback and going, iteratively, instead of sitting in a dark room, figuring everything out and then telling people what the project is. Instead, doing it out in the open and letting people contribute their ideas to it, so they feel like they have a part of it. And then obviously the art component of the check mark itself, and what that says about status and the kind of mimetic value that it has carried since it was introduced by Twitter up until now. And now, like, it's kind of come full circle, where the ultimate status symbol, at least for the people in the checks community, I think, is being able to throw up that one check that signifies that, yes, like, I was either really early or I was really wealthy and I was able to buy a bunch of these and make this myself. And not just the monetary clout, but like Schmrypto said earlier, the clout that comes with being able to burn 64 checks and have no guarantee that you're ever going to get 64x plus in return for that one check. That there's a component that is just pure art. I'm in it for the art. That is really unique, and I hope that all of those different seeds that are planted, including the collaborative aspect, not only with like people interacting with the contract, but with people then building stuff in the future that goes, okay, I want to continue to build in this checks ecosystem. I want to continue to decentralize ownership of these pieces of art. How do we get more people involved? And just seeing how, obviously we're trying to build something there that signifies something, but just, I'm really fascinated to see how this all plays out, and how it's going to change the culture around Web3, and potentially maybe even turn it into more of a mainstream appeal.
Yeah, it's so much more than just the collection, isn't it? There's some really insightful stuff there. Schmrypto, closing thoughts?
I mean, yeah, it's still very early days. The burn, we're still in day 2 of the burn. The mint was 6 or 7 weeks ago. I had somebody tell me, I'm so tired. I've been hearing about checks for months. No, you haven't. You've been hearing about checks for a month. It's been intense. It's been an intense month. longest month of my life for sure. But it's been pretty incredible, and I think we're seeing everything be done right. All the infrastructure has been laid out correctly. The Mint was this immaculate conception. Jack was so transparent in his building. The code that now exists is totally dependency-less. Like, it's just a beautiful thing that he's made here. And I have a hard time imagining a world where museums treasure fidenzas and squiggles but ignore checks. That's really what it comes down to for me.
Makes sense. Gentlemen, thank you so much for your time. I hope that you are right in that you are writing history alongside Jack Butcher. I think you made a compelling case for that, and it's been really interesting to hear your various perspectives on that. So thank you very much for your time.
Thanks so much for hosting.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.